Hello, and welcome to Ralph Reads, brought to you by TURN, the United Ronin Networks. My name is Ralph Anthony Garcia, also known as R4. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the United Ronin Networks. We are Ronin. On this edition of Ralph Reads, I will continue this miniseries featuring Donald Goines Dopefiend, written in 1971, published by Holloway House. As we begin this portion of the miniseries, let the reading commence. Chapter 7. Teddy sat in the front seat of the car, staring out of the window. He was in a black mood. Things had changed for the worst these past 2 weeks. He silently cursed tonight. He had been so high, he'd forgotten how nice it was to have the use of Terry's car. He also felt the loss of the $10 and $20 bills he used to take for granted every time she got paid. Actually, he believed it hadn't really been his fault. The real problem was that Terry had gotten strung out, and that was the reason she had quit him. He told himself this so often that he actually come to believe it. Snake grinned as he glanced around Teddy. He knew just what was eating at him. "I gotta sell for some record albums if we could get some," he said to no one in particular. That tight son of a bitch who owns the record shop on the east side said he would give us $2 apiece for every new record we bring him. The group in the car rode on in silence. All of them were dope fiends, and all of them were looking for something to steal. There were 4 of them in the car, and all of them had the same thought racing through their minds. They all needed a fix. Dirty Red, sitting in the back seat with Tim, spoke up. "I got a sale for 2 lawnmowers that ain't got to be new," he added. "Just as long as they run on gas, we got a sale." They were just beginning a morning of hustling, and the first thing they had to get together on was what did their customers want. All of them had regular customers to whom they sold hot articles every day, and many of their customers requested certain items. Almost any good thieving addict will follow this policy, because if he knows what he can sell and where he can sell it, he'll save a lot of time. People ordered anything from a good dope fiend, anything from a bedsheet up through stoves and refrigerators. Tiny Tim, a short, stocky, dark-skinned addict, spoke up. "I need 25 steaks and 2 hams for Miss B. She says she's having a party this weekend, and she needs the stuff so she can make some money off of dinner. She paying half price, and it's cash money." "What about you, Teddy?" Snake asked, turning sideways to glance at his silent partner. "You know what I need," he replied coldly. "I still got the same customer waiting on that portable TV, but it don't look like we're gonna come up with it." "I don't see nothing wrong with your arms and legs," Dirty Red said harshly. "They got televisions sitting down in the basement at Sears, but I ain't seen you walk in there yet and come out with one." "Shit, Snake," Tim said. "Your sister got a nice one sitting in her bedroom. It would be a hell of a lot easier ripping that one off than walking out one of these stores with one. Your mammy got one sitting downstairs in her house too. Only it just ain't colored," Snake replied loudly, with no apparent anger. Tim thought it over for a minute before replying. "I'll tell you what I'll do, Snake. The day we cop your sisters, we can stop by my house and I'll swing with my mother's." The men in the car rode on in silence, waiting for Snake's reply. If he decided to steal the televisions, they wouldn't have to try their luck in the stores. They all prayed quietly that he would go for it. "If the day ever comes when I need a fix that bad, I'll see if you really mean that, Tim. I'm going to sure find out where your heart is at, 'cause your mammy is going to kick your goddamn ass when she finds out her TV gone," Snake answered. Red yelled suddenly, "There's a wine store, baby! Let's chip in and get a couple of grapes." He added, "Maybe we can swing with some whiskey while we're in there." No sooner did he mention it than Snake pulled over to the curb and parked. Everybody piled out but the driver. Red stuck his hand back in the car window. "Give me some change to help out on the wine." Snake shook his head. "I bought the goddamn gas. Least you can do is buy the motherfucking wine." Red walked away from the car and followed the other two into the store. He hadn't really believed Snake would give up the money, but it never hurt to ask. He caught up with them and broke the sad news. They both cursed over Snake's tightness, more from habit than anger. After giving Red the money for the wine, they all split up inside the store, each man taking a different aisle to go down. Teddy walked up slowly up and down the aisle, searching for something worth stealing. Not finding anything he deemed worth his skill, he walked over to the counter and joined Red. While the druggist waited on them, they watched Tim in the mirror behind the counter. Tim had found the stocking rack, and with his back towards the mirror, he began to load up. He opened the shirt under his light jacket and pushed handful after handful of stockings inside his open shirt. When he finished, he zipped up his jacket and walked slowly up the aisle toward the door. As Red paid for the wine, Teddy walked away, heading over to the stocking rack. He opened his jacket and shirt as he walked. When he reached the rack, he noticed the counter girl busy with another girl customer, so he took 2 handfuls of stockings and continued towards the door. Before he reached his destination, he made one smooth motion and the stockings disappeared under his shirt. When Red joined them at the car, they were counting pairs of stockings. Between them, they had removed 52 pairs of seamless stockings from the rack. They each put up their loot in one of the empty shopping bags lying in the back window of the car. Each man kept count of his and his friend's merchandise, because it was no surprise if at the end of the day, one of his buddies came up with merchandise that belonged to another addict. "After we get another small sting," Snake said as he pulled away from the curb, "we can stop and get a little blow." He grinned at his friends. "I've been feeling boogie ever since this morning. I didn't do but a $5 pack when I woke up. If we listened to you, Snake, we wouldn't never get no hustling done. Between you and Teddy, you stay boogie. It don't make no difference how much dope you shoot in the morning either," Tim said harshly from the back seat. Red poured all cups full of wine. "They got a 5 and 10 cent store right down the street, but the floor walkers are hip to me and Tim." He drank down his wine in one gulp before continuing. "If we go in the store first, we can pull the 2 floor walkers that work on the main floor, and you and Teddy, Snake, can cop the record albums they got setting out." They argued back and forth on how to swing with the LPs. Snake wanted to use the shop box they had in the trunk of the car, but Red argued that they didn't need it. They decided to try and swing with the records with an over-the-shoulder shot, draping their jackets over one shoulder while holding the stolen records in the crook of their arm. That way, it was decided they could steal more albums than they would be able to get away with using their shop box. Snake parked almost in front of the dime store. "I'm leaving the keys in the ashtray here," he informed the group. He glanced up and down the street. "That little short street over there," he said as he pointed over his shoulder. "If we have to run, whoever reaches the car, pull over there and look in the nearest alley. You'll find us somewhere down in it." All of the men glanced at the escape route. It was very important to them because they never knew when they would need it. It was best to know which way you were running before you came out of the store with detectives running behind you. With no hesitation, they always had a good chance of getting away. The floor walkers wouldn't have any car, and once the pickup was made, it was smooth sailing unless they stumbled upon a patrol car. Red and Tim got out first and ambled towards the store. The other 2 waited until they had entered the building before following. Then they got out and went in by another door. Before Red and Tim had even got in the door, the floor walkers, a man and a woman posing as a couple shopping, began to follow them. They walked slowly towards the counters in the back, acting as though they didn't have a care in the world. By the time Teddy and Snake entered, they had drawn the floor walkers as far away from the album counter as it was possible for them to go. Snake's dark face was gleaming with sweat. Out of the group, he was the worst thief in the bunch. His hands shook, and he broke out sweating whenever he was called on to do any stealing. He was tall and thin, and he had a cadaverous look about him. Teddy hated to work with him because he seemed to draw the store walkers as though he were some kind of magnet. From the directions they had been given, Snake and Teddy walked straight to the rack that held the albums. There was no one behind the counter. Quickly, they sorted out the jazz albums and latest rhythm and blues records. They were the ones they knew they could sell. When both of them had a large stack of albums in front of the rack, they made their move. Teddy glanced around him casually. He waited until two women shoppers had ambled past, then picked up an armful of records and put them under his jacket, which was hanging off one shoulder. Snake followed suit. Without looking back, they walked swiftly towards the front of the store. From the rear of the dime store, Red watched them leave. Tim caught his eye and laid down some women's articles he had been fingering. He turned towards the two floor walkers who had worked up beside them. "If I were you," he said pleasantly, "I'd shop down the street. This store seems to carry some of the worst merchandise in town." He slapped Red on the back and they both walked away laughing. Back at the car, Snake and Teddy waited impatiently for them. It had been a good sting. Teddy had 18 albums and Snake had 15. The morning was starting off nicely. When Red and Tim returned to the car, they were both still laughing, more from the release of tension than anything else. As soon as Red got in the car, he poured out the last of the wine in the first bottle and opened the second one. "Man, we damn near got enough stuff to go and buy us an eye-opener now. We can cop the rest of the stuff later on this afternoon." They kicked the idea around, back and forth until Snake spoke up. "You niggas is a bitch. You know goddamn well if we quit now, you ain't gonna want to steal nothing later on until all the dope is gone." "That's the truth," Teddy testified loudly. "And then after you get high, you gon' be nodding all over the fucking stores. We better get the business taken care of while we're able to handle it." They drank the wine without speaking. Tiny Tim broke the silence. "Suppose we just cop the meat or the lawnmowers, then call it a day." "That sounds sweet," Snake replied. "We'll run out to the Westgate Shopping Center first and check it out. We ain't been out there in over a month. So that goddamn manager they got out there done just about forgot what we look like." Teddy put his cup on the top of the seat for a refill. "They got a mirror system out there now. Me and Red went out last week and played for some steaks." "It ain't shit though," Red said knowingly. "They got a blind spot right at the milk and egg department. All you gotta do is carry your meat over there and make your shot under the mirror so they can't see you." He continued, "That new market that opened up next door ain't got nothing but an old guard about 80 years old, so he ain't no problem. I guess they hired him to scare away the housewives that do a little stealing, but he ain't shit for anyone like us." "We'll give it a try then," Snake said, and turned off on the closest street that led to the freeway. The shopping center was full when they pulled in and parked. They all climbed out of the car at the same time, then split up into pairs. In less than 10 minutes, Teddy and Snake were back from the first market. They climbed in the front seat and put their meat in a shopping bag. They had stolen 5 steaks apiece. Before they could get out of the car, Red and Tim walked up and jumped in the back seat. "How did it look in there?" Teddy asked quietly as he watched them remove steaks from under their armpits and from between their belts and pants. "Sweet, baby, sweet!" Tim exclaimed loudly. "The old cop is helping fill bags at the checkout counter. When you go in, slide under the rail and he won't even know you're in the fucking store. We came out that way. His back was turned towards us the whole time we was in there." "Mellow," Snake replied and got out. Teddy followed him closely. They entered the store, slipped under the rail, and slowly walked to the back of the market where the meat was kept. Both men took their time picking over the steaks. They only wanted the most expensive meat they could find. All the $3 steaks they came across, they tossed back as too cheap. Since both of them were counting on an easy sting, they loaded up. Teddy picked up 9 steaks, 5 in one hand, 4 in the other. Snake followed right behind him. As he went up the aisle nearest the door, Teddy opened his shirt front wide. First, he put 4 steaks up under one armpit, then pushed the rest up under the other one. His light fall jacket was bulging at both sides. It would have been impossible for him to go through one of the checkout lines, so clearly could the outline of the meat be seen. Teddy glanced back over his shoulder at Snake. The first thing that caught his attention was the woman who worked on the meat counter. She was standing in the back watching Snake. Before he could give Snake a warning, the meat disappeared under his jacket. The woman stared after them for a moment with her mouth open, then swiftly turned and vanished. "Quick, baby! The woman saw you swing!" Teddy yelled. The woman shoppers in the aisle glanced up at them. Surprise spread across their faces as they watched the two young men break and run. Teddy reached the rail and went under it quickly, Snake one step behind him, stepping on his heels. Before the alarm was given, they were out of the supermarket and running for the car. Red and Tim, already in the car, saw them coming. They jumped in, and before the runners could reach the car, the motor was humming. Both men jumped in the back and hugged the floor. Red pressed down on the gas and raced for the nearest exit. In his rear view mirror, he saw two men run out of the store and look up and down, but they hadn't seen which way the thieves had gone. A woman standing on the sidewalk pointed at the speeding car, but it was much too late. In a matter of minutes, they were on the freeway, heading back to the heart of the city. Again, their wild laughter filled the car. It hadn't even been close. To them, it was all in a day's work. In the run of a month, they had many experiences like this. In another month, they will be back in the same store, trying their luck again. "Which way should we go?" Red asked sharply, watching this rearview mirror. "I doubt if they had enough time to make it to a phone, but it ain't no sense taking any chances." "Get up off the expressway, baby," Snake ordered. "Then find the quickest route to get us to the east side." They made it across town and stopped at the record shop. Snake and Teddy went in and sold the albums. Next, they stopped off and sold the meat, letting the women's nylons go for less than half price. The money off the meat alone was over $100. For the albums, they settled on $75, and for the stockings, they got $25. After taking out for the gas and wine, they still cleared over $200 for a little over an hour's work. Snake stopped at a dope house on the east side. All of them chipped in $25 apiece. He was gone about 10 minutes before he returned with another man. They climbed in the car. "He ain't got nothing but pills," Snake responded to the unspoken question. "So I didn't cop none." He nodded towards the man who had gotten in the car with him. "Lee here says he knows where to cop the bomb at. We can get a half a piece of stuff for $100. All of the men in the car stared closely at the new man. They had hassled too hard to allow another addict to come along and burn them for their money. Tiny Tim said what they all were thinking. "I wouldn't allow Lee to look at my money too long, let alone take it somewhere and cop. He ain't about to leave me sitting out in front of some apartment building when he runs out the back door with all my bread in his pocket." "Ain't that the truth?" Red muttered. "I wouldn't trust Lee in a shithouse with a muzzle on." Lee was a short, balding man, turning to fat in his late 20s. He listened to them without any apparent concern. What they had said was just about true. No matter how close friends they might be, $100 would be a lot of temptation. "What's the matter with you? You think I'm a fool or something?" Snake asked hotly. "Whenever my money goes out of sight, I'm going with it." Teddy spoke up. "What's Lee gonna get out of it since he's so willing to take us to cop?" "Nothing," Snake replied bluntly. "All he wants for me to do is take him by his wife's house so he can pick up his TV to pawn." He didn't wait for any replies, but started the car and pulled away from the curb. "Man, I'm sick!" Red exclaimed loudly. "I thought we were going to cop some stuff, and now here we are running all over town." "It ain't but a couple of blocks away," Lee said. "What I need is some help lifting the damn thing, 'cause it's a floor model." Lee pointed out the directions, and in a few minutes they pulled up in front of a small frame house. Lee got out, with Snake following him. They went up the front steps, and Lee walked in without knocking. In the front room, 5 little children were sitting on the floor watching cartoons on television. Without bothering to speak, Lee unplugged the TV and began winding up the cord. The children let out a yell, and their mother came running in from the kitchen. She stopped at the sight of the 2 men and put her hands on her hips. She was a tall, very light-skinned woman, thin to the point of being frail, with freckles covering her nose. Her large bosom heaved up and down with controlled wrath. Her eyes narrowed, glittering with disgust. You done took everything else out of the house to sell, you low-down bastard. So now you done decided to take the only thing the children got they can enjoy. She sat down and put her arms around two of the children. Don't you worry and quit that crying. She pulled the children closer in an attempt to stop their tears. Just get out, Lee. If you don't never come back, we can consider ourselves lucky. Snake picked up his end of the television. He was in a hurry to get away with it. He hated to see the children cry. But the $10 he was getting for helping smoothed over his small concern. They carried the floor model television out to the car. The sound of the kids crying followed them outside. The set was so large, they had to put it in the trunk of the car and leave part of it hanging out. The rest of the men grumbled until they reached the pawn shop. They worried over the possibility of the police stopping them. If a police car should happen to pass them and see the TV, it was an automatic search. They didn't stop talking about it until after they had pawned it and reached the dope house. Snake went in with Lee, and when he returned, he stared up and down the street closely before walking to the car. From his behavior, the men in the car knew he had reached the man and made a score. Chapter 8. The rain was still falling in an infernal downpour. Terry tossed the magazine down on the couch and got up. She paced up and down, wondering where she could put her hands on $10. She sniffed suddenly. Her nose was leaking again. God damn it, she cursed quietly. I have to get $10. She quickly rejected the idea of trying to borrow it from her mother. That's out, she muttered, and ran up the steps. The sound of her father's loud snoring came to her, and she hesitated outside his room. She fought down the temptation to slip into his room and tried to remove $10 from his pocket. Suddenly, a new idea popped into her head. She rushed over to her dresser and searched wildly until she found her address book. She flipped the pages until she found what she was looking for. Holding the page open with one finger, she quickly dialed the number. Hello, she said as soon as the receiver on the other end was picked up. Could I speak to Billy? She asked, annoyed by the sound of a feminine voice on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, but he's in school. Could I take a message? The voice was kind and pleasing. Terry slammed the phone down, not bothering to answer. She stretched out on the bed, fighting back the tears. Tears won't help you now, girl, a small voice inside her warned. She twisted over on the bed. A hot flash ran through her, followed quickly by sweat running down her armpits. She rolled over on the bed, her legs beginning to feel stiff and heavy. What am I gonna do? She cried silently into the pillow. She sat up quickly as cold chills shot through her body. She stared at the tiny portable radio sitting on the dresser. It's useless, she told herself miserably. It didn't cost over $10 when it was new. Terry jumped up and ran to the window and stared out, her mind racing frantically. She trembled from a chill and hugged herself tightly. She retraced her steps and snatched up the phone. She dialed the number, tapping her foot impatiently. Porky? Her voice was almost hysterical. I got to have a favor from you. You don't have to have anything, young lady. But first of all, who do I have the pleasure of speaking to? His voice was low and sweet. Porky! She almost screamed. This is Terry. I got some money coming tonight, Porky. Porky, are you listening? She asked frantically. Yes, dear Terry, but I'm not interested in anything you might have tonight. Money, honey. That's the new magic word in the 70s. Ain't you hip? He laughed uproariously. She began to plead. Listen, Porky, please, if you won't give me no credit, how about letting me bring you my winter coat? I just want to pawn it to you until I get off from work tonight. Listen, Terry, he ordered, his voice brittle. You already owe me $20, dear, so I don't think I can allow you to go any deeper in debt. Suddenly his voice became sweet again. He started to sing. It's raining outside, and I'm in the mood for love. Terry sobbed and slammed the phone down. You dirty, dirty bastard. bastard," she muttered as she fought back the tears in the corners of her eyes. The sound of her father snoring came to her. Her addict's mind quickly came up with another idea. Snatching up a piece of Kleenex, she wiped her nose as she ran out of the room. She knocked lightly on her father's door. When there was no answer, she pushed open the door and stepped in. He was still sleeping. She grabbed his arm. "Wake up, Daddy, wake up!" He rolled over and sat up, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. "Terry, what you want, girl?" He glanced at the clock on the table at the side of the bed. "My God, it ain't nowhere near time to get up." He slipped back down between the covers and would have pulled them up over his head if it hadn't been for Terry. She grabbed the sheets and pulled them back down. "Listen, Daddy," she said in desperation. "I got to have you do something for me." He glanced up at his daughter. "Well, what is it, girl? So I can go back to sleep." "Daddy, they got a sale on at the store, and I got the most beautiful coat picked out for Mama." He grunted and tried to grab the bed covers. "Ain't that nice?" he managed to say. She sat down on the bed, determined not to give him any peace. "Daddy, the sale ends tonight, and they won't let me put it in the layaway unless I put up $10. "Your mama already got 2 winter coats, Terry," he answered, more awake now. "Aw, Daddy, them things is all out of style. You don't want Mama going to church with them old things on this winter." He grunted again and made as if to roll over. "Please, Daddy, please," she begged, a slight sob catching in her throat. "How much do you need, Terry?" he asked finally, wishing his daughter were elsewhere. "Just $10, Daddy, that's all," she answered quickly. She sniffed and wiped her nose. "Get it out of my pants then. But don't come in here waking me up no more, girl. I'm out no damn money," he growled and rolled over, attempting to go back to sleep. Terry got the money and ran from the room. She stopped and snatched up a fall coat and her large pocketbook. When she got to the front porch, she put the coat over her head and ran for her car. When she reached Porky's, she had to wait until he finished having fun with Jean. Jean stood in the middle of the floor in agony because of the heavy downpour. The tricks had stopped riding, or rather, she hadn't been able to catch one. Her nose was running also, and she was a pitiful sight, and the natural she wore was out of shape. She had removed her spring coat to allow the water to drip from it, and the abscesses on her arms were oozing pus. The yellowish fluid was running down slowly from the open sores on the back of her hands and on her forearms. "If you need stuff, Jean, I done told you what you'd have to do. If I wasn't scared of you giving my dogs the syphilis, I'd have you put on a little floor show for the folks. But you look so nasty, I don't even know if my dogs can get their bones up for you." He waited until all the psychopaths sitting around the apartment laughed on cue before continuing. "If you really want some dope, baby, just start making the rounds." He pointed at all the addicts sitting around. "Just give them a lick or two on their bones. When you finish with them, come on back around to me, and I'll let you polish this knob until it spits." Porky glanced at Terry. "If you ain't got no money, you just get on your knees too and follow her around the room." There were a few snickers, and some of the male addicts glanced at her expectantly. Jean, too sick to care, stopped at the first male addict. He unbuttoned his pants and grinned foolishly at the rest of the people in the room. Terry watched in disgust. She removed a $10 bill from her bra and walked over and gave it to Smokey. Jean left the first man, and he rebuttoned his pants. She stopped in front of a junkie drawing up some dope. He waved her away angrily. She continued on around the room, stopping in front of all the men, giving them a chance to put their penis in her mouth. Most of the time, she was flatly refused. The addicts were more interested in putting dope in their arms than in being part of a show. She stopped in front of Porky, who removed and his own minutes from his pants as she dropped to her knees. Terry turned her head away, sickened. She staggered to the couch and sat down, keeping her face averted from the sight that was going on in the room. She could still hear the animal sounds coming from Porky as he directed Jean's efforts with a detachment that belied his enjoyment. Without any show of emotion, Smokey got up and walked into the small kitchen. When she returned, she was carrying a small pan full of water and a clean rag. She waited patiently until Porky reached his climax, then walked over as Jean got up from her knees and washed him off, her face expressionless. Porky grunted. "Give the hot-headed bitch a half a fourth," he ordered loudly. "If any of you other bitches happen to want to blow, you better speak up now. If you wait till later, I might not be in the mood to watch no show." The few dope fiend women in the room ignored him and continued to finish whatever they were doing. Jean walked over to the couch and found the largest cooker she could get her hands on. She shook out most of the dope in the package Smokey gave her. Her fingers shook as she lit a match under the Vaseline top. As soon as dope melted down, she took a set of works out of her bra and drew up a dropper full of dope. "You're gonna fuck around and kill your ignorant ass, bitch," Porky said loudly as he watched her prepare to shoot all the dope. She didn't bother to reply as she stuck the needle down into one of the many sores on her hand. She got a hit and slowly closed her eyes and ran the dope in. Terry shuddered as she noticed the open sores. It was really a house of horrors, she thought. Jean ran the dope in, then removed the dropper from the spike, leaving the needle still in her hand. She drew up the rest of the dope and ran it in quickly. Before she could take the spike out, she fell over on the floor. "The bitch done had an OD," a few of the junkies yelled together. Before Jean had hit the floor good, Porky's doorman and Smokey went into action. "Get some salt water," Gigi yelled. Smokey came out of the kitchen carrying a tray full of ice cubes. She knelt down beside the stricken woman and raised her dress. She began to insert the chilling ice into Jean's womb, while another girl put ice cubes around her neck and bosom. Gigi drew up a dropper full of salt water and shot it into her veins. They worked on her quickly and professionally. Porky watched silently. As soon as she moaned and got propped up, he stood up and walked over. "Big Ed," he yelled, "as soon as that bitch gets awoke enough to hold up, you get her the fuck out of here. I don't care where you take her. The nearest alley is good enough. Just see to it that she ain't nowhere near this house." He turned and glared at the addicts watching him closely. "If I hear word of her having had that OD anywhere near this house, don't none of you come back, 'cause my doors will be closed." His voice was sharp. It was a deadly threat he had given. To a dope fiend, it was no small matter to be able to cop from Porky. He always had dope, and it was the best in the city. Terry watched silently as the two men half-carried, half-dragged Jean from the apartment. "I wonder what they'll do with her," she said quietly, not even aware that the attic next to her had heard. "They'll take her to some alley and drop her in it if she don't wake up soon," he offered quietly. She shuddered at their ruthlessness. A slow awareness of what she had become involved in forced her to ask, "But suppose she dies, then what?" The dope fiend shrugged his shoulders. "So what? Another dead dope fiend, that's all. You gonna lose any tears over it? If you ain't, the police sure in the fuck ain't, you dig?" "I guess not," she muttered and took another snort of her dope. As the heroin quickly took effect, she began to drift off, the episode almost forgotten. Chapter 9. The rain was still falling as Minnie hurried towards the department store. It had been a wonderful opportunity for her, she reasoned, when she and Terry had started working together. With Terry working on the inside of the store, it was almost impossible for a floor walker to bust her, because Terry knew them all. She clutched the bag she was carrying in her arms, trying to keep it from getting too wet. Inside the bag were 2 expensive sweaters she was taking back for a refund. With Terry's help earlier, she had been able to steal them. Instead of selling them for half price, Terry had told her to bring them back and she would refund them, giving her their full value plus tax. She entered the department store, wondering idly if Terry had heard the latest news about Jean. How many times have I told that bitch not to be so greedy, she thought. Well, she won't have to worry about it anymore. They had found her slumped over a cup of coffee in a restaurant, dead. That was a hell of a way to die, but when you left here, there couldn't be a better way to go than high, Minnie thought philosophically. Terry paused briefly, then continued waiting on the customer she had been taking care of when Minnie walked up. In a few minutes, the customer left, and she began to make out a refund slip for Minnie. "Did you bring that blow for me?" she asked anxiously, although she didn't really need one. The thought of having a hit on the way filled her with anticipation. Her hands fluttered nervously as she waited for Minnie's answer. Minnie watched her closely. "You got it bad, ain't you, honey? You better cut down on your blows, Terry, or you're gonna end up with an oil burner." As she spoke, she removed a small pack of heroin and slipped it under the bag she had laid on the counter. The sight of the drug caused Terry to break wind loudly. She blushed, snatched up the small package, and hurried towards the restroom. She clutched at her stomach. The closer she got, the more compelling it seemed that she was about to have a bowel movement. Minnie watched her leave with concern. It would have looked better if Terry had waited until she had left the counter. She waited until Terry disappeared from sight, then turned and made her way toward the refund counter, unaware that she had been under surveillance ever since she entered the store. Terry found an empty stall in the restroom and went in. No sooner had she entered it, another woman came to the restroom door. The sound of someone washing her hands came to her, but Terry paid it no heed. She cursed silently. She had forgotten to stop and get her purse. Now she didn't have anything to make a quill with. It would have been too convenient to go back for the purse, so she just opened the tiny package and held it close to her nose and snorted. Doing it this way caused her to waste a small amount of the dope, but it didn't disturb her. The only thing that mattered was that she got most of it into her system. It didn't occur to her that the drug didn't make her high anymore, unless she had a large amount of it. She just knew the drug made her feel normal again. And that was what she so desperately sought. The drug had become a temporary relief from the terrible desire that ate at her mind and body every day until it had been appeased. After the drug brought on its mellowing effect, Terry again thought about going to a doctor for help. But it was always this way after she had satisfied the nagging hunger of the habit. When she was sick, there was but one thought on her mind: where could she get a fix? She had promised herself time and time again that she would seek out a doctor, but when she awoke in the morning craving the fix, the only thing she would seek would be the nearest dope house. Terry opened the door and stepped out. The woman standing at the faucet watched her in the mirror. Terry nodded her head in a form of greeting and walked over and looked in the mirror. The first thing she noticed was a small amount of white powder on the edge of her nose. With the back of her hand, she removed it and, telling herself the other woman wouldn't know what was happening, snorted it off her hand. Something in the back of her mind rang a bell. She tried to place the woman next to her. Suddenly, it dawned on her. The woman was one of the extra floor walkers the store hired to help keep down their loss of merchandise from shoplifters. She washed up quickly and left the woman in the restroom. After picking up the refund for the 2 sweaters, Minnie came back to Terry's department. She fingered some dresses as she waited for Terry to return. It had been a good day's hustling for both of them, she reasoned. Both sweaters had sold for over $39 separately. With the tax money added on, each sweater had bought over $40 on the refund. $80 wasn't a bad day's work, and with her stomach getting larger every day, she would have to find another way of hustling other than whoring. She glanced around casually as she waited for Terry to come back and wait for her. The department store was one of the largest in Detroit. It carried a full supply of almost any kind of merchandise a woman could want. The departments on the upper floors carried furs and expensive jewelry, while the basement held a full range of furniture, from couches to wall-to-wall carpets. Under a cheap dress she had picked out, Minnie placed 3 Kimberly knit 2-piece outfits. She glanced around casually. There was no one shopping near them but 2 elderly women. So when Terry approached, she held the bundle out to her. Terry accepted the clothes and walked over towards her counter. She stopped at the cash register. After taking a brief glance around to satisfy her fear, she began to write up the order. Intentionally, she left out the 3 expensive Kimberly knits. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded up the dresses and put them all neatly into a white box. Casually, Minnie gave her a $10 bill. Terry took it, rang up the cash register, and gave Minnie a few dollars back as change. Minnie picked up the box and started walking slowly towards the door. As soon as she reached the exit, two women came up beside her and took her by the arms. "Just come with us quietly, dear," one of them said softly. From a dress counter, farther back in the store, Terry watched the arrest going on. A stab of fear jolted her. It suddenly entered her mind that she might get arrested too. Before she could react, she saw her supervisor approaching in the company of two other women. "Terry, we would like to see you in the office. Please follow me." It was a request, but it had the sting of an order behind it. Mrs. Breeding waited until Terry came from behind her counter, then led the way towards her office as the other women dropped behind and brought up the rear. The other salesgirls standing at the counters watched the procession curiously. When they reached the office and stepped in, Minnie was already there, standing against the wall, looking as though the world had come to an end. Her head hung down, and she refused to meet the eyes of any of the women detectives in the room. A stout, heavy-faced woman was behind the desk, removing the knit dresses from the box. "Well, would you look at this? What in the world could these be?" she asked with pretended innocence. Mrs. Breeding, the supervisor, stared at the dresses as though she couldn't believe her eyes. "When I was informed about this, Terry, I didn't believe it. I thought that a grievous error had been made. In fact, all the while we were walking toward this room, I was trying to figure out how I could apologize to you for bringing you here. But now, I'm just about shocked out of my senses." She sat down behind her desk in a daze. She picked up the clothes and felt them, as if trying to prove to herself it was not a bad dream. "This is utterly unbelievable," she murmured softly. "Why, I've known this child's parents for over 20 years. She has no reason in the world to steal." She spoke to the other women in the room, but actually, she was speaking to herself. "I don't know what to make of this. There's the evidence right before my eyes, yet I still don't want to accept it." She picked up the sales slip and slammed it back down on the desk. Her eyes fell on Minnie leaning against the wall. "Now that," she said, pointing an angry finger in Minnie's direction, "that I wouldn't expect anything else out of. But you, Terry? This is disgraceful. What will your mother think? How will she feel? Did you ever give it a thought?" The questions came fast and hard. "Not even to mention the disgrace you've brought upon yourself, Terry. That's nothing compared to the shock and hurt your parents will receive from this. Didn't you even consider that you could end up in jail for stealing?" Mrs. Breeding shook her abundance of graying hair and glared angrily at Terry. The door opened, and the woman who had been in the toilet with Terry came into the office. She walked straight over to Minnie and picked up one of her arms. The tracks running up and down the veins stood out in all their sinister implications. "This girl here is on some kind of drug, Mrs. Breeding. I believe it's heroin." She dropped Minnie's arm. "I don't know for sure, but when I went into the John, I think Terry was using some kind of drug also," she said coldly. Mrs. Breeding came out of her chair as though shot from a cannon. "Is that true, Terry? Have you been foolish enough to get yourself involved with some kind of addicts?" "No, ma'am," Terry answered in a timid voice. She had been high when she entered the room, but the fear of arrest was like a splash of cold water on her face. She searched frantically for a lie that would get her out of this trouble. If there was any hope of salvation, she had to find it. The very thought of having the store press charges against her for shoplifting was stupefying. If she would have to appear in court in front of all the people, just like a common criminal, she would just die. The thought made her turn crimson. Mrs. Breeding, seeing her blush, thought that Terry was ashamed of just being accused of using drugs. There was no possible way, she thought angrily, that a nice girl like Terry could actually be on anything like dope. She couldn't bring herself to think about it, let alone believe Terry guilty of it. She called two of the women detectives over to her desk. They whispered quietly among themselves for a few minutes. Every once in a while, one of the women would shake her head vigorously. Not the other one, Terry managed to hear, as she leaned forward trying to catch snatches of the conversation. Mrs. Breeding came around to the front of the desk and leaned against it. "Terry, because of your mother's honesty and goodness, I can't be the one to cause her a broken heart. She worked for me for over 20 years, so I owe her something more than heartache. Because of this, young lady, we're going to give you a break. You don't deserve it, but I'm doing it because of my deep respect for your mother." She paused for a moment, walked behind the desk, and opened the drawer. "Here," she snapped, taking out a check and tossing it on the desk. "We have decided to keep this amongst ourselves. This is your last check, Terry. What you have coming next week, we will keep to pay for the articles you and your friends have stolen." She glared at Terry, hurt and bewilderment in her eyes. "If for any reason you're ever seen in this store, you will be arrested on sight, Terry. Now, if you don't like us keeping your other check, you can get ready to go to the nearest police station and take it up with a judge in the morning. It's your decision." Her voice had grown harsh. "Speak up now. What do you want to do? It doesn't make any difference to me." For a brief moment, Terry couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then it dawned on her that they were really going to let her go. She was really going to get out of it. Relief flooded through her. "Yes, ma'am, I understand," she managed to answer. "You won't have to ever worry about me coming back in the store anymore either." She hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Is it all right if I leave now?" Mrs. Breeding just glared at her. There was so much she wanted to say, to find out, but it wouldn't do any good, she reasoned. "Yes, you can go now. Just be sure to take that with you." She pointed her finger at Minnie. Before Terry and Minnie had even left the room, Mrs. Breeding picked up the phone and dialed Terry's home number. Terry's mother answered the phone, and Mrs. Breeding broke the bad news. There was a sound of someone trying to stifle a sob, then silence. After a few moments' wait, Mrs. Breeding asked with concern, "Are you all right, Mrs. Wilson?" Mrs. Wilson sat as though she were dead. The phone dangled down from her lap, hanging like a dead limb on a tree. Mr. Wilson stared at his wife in surprise. He walked over and picked up the hanging receiver. After listening to the voice on the other end of the line, he thanked the woman for calling and hung up the phone gently. His wife stared at the wall, dazed. It was not just a phone call. She had been dreading something like this for the past month. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she had sensed something happening to Terry that was out of the ordinary. Mr. Wilson sat down on the arm of the stuffed chair and put his arm around his wife's plump shoulders. His voice was low and tender. "Now, dear, don't take this too hard. There has to be a reason behind it. Terry is no thief. You and I both know that. There must have been some kind of misunderstanding that we don't even know about. Let's not judge Terry until we hear what she has to say about it." His voice was firm and full of confidence in his daughter. Leona Wilson snatched at her husband's words the way a drowning person would grab at a piece of driftwood. "You're absolutely right, Herman," she said. "I don't know what I was thinking about. We must wait and hear what Terry has to say. It's just that Mrs. Breeding mentioned the use of some kind of dope. I didn't understand just what she was getting at, but she mentioned some other girl with Terry who used dope." She stopped and thought for a second, then added, "Why, I don't even think that Terry would know what dope looked like if she saw it. I know I wouldn't." She laughed self-consciously at her own ignorance. She continued, "The idea of it is so preposterous that just for a moment it threw me off. Nowadays, you hear and read so much about young kids getting hooked on all these awful drugs that for a minute it just knocked me off my feet." She smiled up at her husband, trying to find assurance, hoping that his defense of Terry would ease her anxiety about her daughter's peculiar behavior. Herman had no doubts whatsoever about his daughter. Dope was something you read about, not something that came home and hit you in the face. Not if you were the kind of man he was. He worked hard so that he could give his family everything they wanted within reason. Dope was something the kids in the slums used, not a girl like Terry. She had everything a young girl could want. Dope! He had to laugh at the thought. He had given Terry more than the average white child received growing up. No, dope was one problem he didn't have to worry about. He leaned over, kissed his wife's cheek. "Now don't worry, Mother. We don't have anything to worry about. As soon as Terry comes home, she'll explain what happened. I know she's feeling bad about losing her job, so we won't say too much to her about it. All we want is an answer to why she let herself get involved with that other girl. Mrs. Breeding said there was no doubt about it. The other girl was a drug addict. More than likely, Terry was probably trying to help her out. He smiled at his wife reassuringly. I'll be willing to bet that it was probably one of her old school friends who turned out bad, and Terry was just trying to help her. In his attempt to comfort his wife, he began to believe his own excuses. The more he talked, the more he began to believe it had to be the other girl's fault. Chapter 10. Her mind was in such turmoil that Minnie had to lead her to her car, parked at the curb. You can always find another job, Terry. It ain't nowhere near as bad as you think it is. She remained silent until after she got behind the steering wheel. She stuck the key in the ignition. It ain't the idea of losing the job that I'm worried about. It's what my parents will say about it, she replied softly. Yeah, I guess you got a point there, Minnie answered offhandedly. She opened her purse and removed the money they had made on the refund. Well, at least they ain't take back the money we made off the sweaters. If they did that, we sure be in a hell of a fix right now, she spoke in a matter-of-fact voice. Terry pulled away from the curb and slipped into the slowly passing traffic. I'm in enough of a goddamn fix now without worrying about some damn dope, she said bitterly. She was just beginning to realize the significance of what had happened. I'm going to stop using, she declared loudly. Sure, honey, I know all about it. Every dope fiend I know is going to stop using one day, Minnie answered coldly. The only thing is that when they do stop, they're usually in jail or someone is tossing dirt in their face like what's going to happen to Jean now. She ain't got no worry about the Chinaman no more. No, sir. As soon as she gets her face full of dirt, it will be just another dope fiend gone, honey. Terry drove on, listening to Minnie's chatter, nodding her head perfunctorily. The handwriting was on the wall, she thought coldly. She knew that she would have to do something about her drug problem, and problem was the understatement of the year. How she had ever allowed herself to get into such a condition was beyond her comprehension. Her mind shied away from the naked reality of her addiction. Her hands began to clench and unclench on the steering wheel as she screamed silently over and over again, "No! No! No!" Minnie pushed her share of the refund money across the seat. I don't know about you, Terry, but I would like to stop and get a blow. The mention of a fix had a psychological effect on Terry. Immediately, she began to have a slight yearning for some dope. She tried to put the thought out of her mind, but it kept coming back. Without actually realizing what she was doing, she had started to drive faster. I won't even get out of the car, she promised herself quietly. I'll just drop Minnie off and keep on going. A small voice in the back of her mind started to laugh. The sound grew until it was a roar in her head. The laughter was cruel. It made a mockery of her pretensions. A flash of insight came to her, cold, revealing, and brutal. Behind all this scorn for herself, there lurked a truth too revealing to be openly expected. All of her problems have been conveniently forgotten while her thoughts dwelled on one subject: dope. Terry snatched her share of the money from the car seat and clutched it tightly in her fist. Before she realized where she was, she had pulled over to the curb and parked in front of Porky's house. She moved as though she were a sleepwalker. When Minnie got out of the car, she followed behind her, unable to control her own will. She felt a genuine desire to put an end to this self-punishment, but the urge for the drug was too strong to fight alone. She needed help, needed it desperately, and knew she needed it, but was unable to reach out for it, wherever it might have been. Terry followed Minnie up the stairs like an obedient child. The closer she got to the door of the dope house, the more demanding grew the desire for a fix. She began to pray that Porky would be home and not out of dope. Her prayer was answered. Porky opened the door slightly as they reached the top of the stairway. "Well, well, what we have here?" he asked in a husky voice. He stood in the middle of the doorway so that both of them would have to squeeze past him. His huge stomach pressed Terry against the doorframe as she inched by. She plunged into the room. She stopped suddenly and stared in surprise. Two women were lying in the middle of the floor side by side, naked as on the day they came into this world. Porky put the large 2x4 back across the door, making it virtually impossible for anyone to kick in his door without giving him enough time to throw away his dope. His back door was barred the same way in case the police should try that entrance. "You girls are just in time," Porky said lightly. Those two ladies were just about to begin entertaining us. He added as an afterthought, "If either one of you would like to join in the show on the floor, why, I must just find it entertaining enough to put out a fourth of dope for your disposal." The two women on the floor looked at them anxiously. "Come on, Minnie," one of them called. "It ain't about nothing," she said, and winked her eye. Minnie stared at the women. She knew what they were going to work out of. With four women twisting around on the floor, all it would really boil down to was letting the men see some bare ass. They would end up faking most of the oral sex the men thought they were seeing. All she would have to do was put her mouth down between another woman's legs, and the men looking on wouldn't know if she was doing anything or not. Actually, Porky was the only one who would really be watching them. The male addicts would be too busy nodding, and the few women sitting around couldn't care less. Minnie glanced at Terry. The way Terry was staring at the women on the floor was enough of an answer for her. With her pregnancy facing her, the last thing she could afford to do was antagonize Terry. She realized that the bigger her stomach became, the more she would be forced to depend on Terry's goodwill. With the car that she owned, Terry would be indispensable. Give her a couple of more months of steady using, and a sight like this would be the last thing in the world to shock her. More than likely, Terry would be participating in the shows herself. "No, honey," she replied to the woman on the floor. "I think we'll just watch." Terry fumbled in her purse and brought out $10. "Here, Porky," she said, holding the money toward him nervously. Smokey got up from the couch and came over and removed the money from her outstretched hand. Porky grinned at her. "You know you ain't got to spend no money, Terry. All you got to do is join the other ladies on the floor." She stared at him, astonished. "You hold your goddamn breath, nigga, until you see me laying on the floor making a spectacle of myself for one of you freaks." Her small bosom swelled with anger, while her eyes glinted with unconcealed fury. Her violent reaction worked as a stimulant on Porky. He could feel himself beginning to have an erection. His hand slid down to his penis, and he unconsciously began to stroke himself. His breathing became heavy, while his reptilian eyes closed and unclosed in ecstasy. Terry was overwhelmed with repugnance as she watched him. The fleeting thought that such a man held power over her filled her with dread. She made a silent promise that this would be her last fix. After today, she would find some way of getting help. Somehow, she would find the strength. Minnie spoke up. Her voice was harsh and sarcastic. "Whenever you finish jacking off, Porky, we would appreciate it if you would take care of your business." She held out a $10 bill toward him. Porky stared at her coldly. His small eyes glittered with open scorn. Minnie brought to his mind all the rejections he had received from girls while going to school. They had all talked to him as if he should be thankful they allowed him to breathe the free air. In truth, he had a deep hatred for humanity. He could never forget the horror of his gaze. He had been very sensitive about his abnormal size. Time and time again, he had tried to reach out across the span that separated him from the other children, desperately wanting to be accepted. The only time the other kids would allow him to play was when they felt like ridiculing him. Pig had been his nickname back then. But when he got older and began to realize the power a dope bag brought to the pusher, he quickly put an end to being called Pig. He had always been grotesquely fat, no matter how much he tried to lose weight. Their family doctor had told his mother it was a gland problem, so not to worry about it. Some people were just meant to be large. As he grew older, he realized that many people feared him just because of his features. He even admitted to himself that he resembled a gorilla. What he really enjoyed, though, was the fear that he inspired in women. It aroused him the way nothing else could. There was nothing he enjoyed more than sleeping with a woman who was petrified by fear. Many of them became paralyzed, practically statues of stone, when he started making love to them. Smokey took the money out of Minnie's hand as Porky lumbered over to his overstuffed chair and sat down. "Don't get beside yourself, bitch," she warned Minnie as she gave them each a pack of dope. "You bitches ain't getting paid just to lay on the floor," Porky yelled loudly at the two women on the floor. Minnie rolled her eyes at Smokey, but didn't reply. Smoke resembled a robot, a walking zombie. Porky kept her so high that most of the time, it seemed she wasn't aware where she was. Whenever the addicts discussed her abnormal habit, they spoke in voices full of awe. She was completely at the mercy of Porky's whims. If he were to put her out, her chances of staying alive would be small. Her daily use of heroin would cost an addict on the street over $500 a day. In the run of a week, she used the retail value of over $3,000 worth of dope. Smokey headed back towards the bedroom, stepping over the two women on the floor. She stared past them, her dilated eyes not even seeing them. She lacked the slightest interest in what they were about to do. As Minnie and Terry took their dope and sat down beside each other, the two women on the floor began to perform. More for their own benefit, really, than for anyone watching. Each woman stretched out with her head pointed towards the other's feet, while their legs interwove intimately. They were using the scissors position, a favorite of professional lesbians. And as they rubbed cunt to cunt, it became apparent that there was nothing fake about this. Both women were thoroughly enjoying themselves to such a degree that no other person seemed to exist in the apartment for them. Terry found herself blushing as she watched the women. My God, she thought, this can't really be happening. Not in a room full of people, and most of them men. She cautiously glanced out of the corner of her eye to see how the men were reacting to this grotesque display. To her astonishment, very few of the male addicts were actually watching. Most of them were too involved in trying to find a vein to shoot their dope in, while those who had already shot up were nodding as though nothing at all strange were going on. Here and there, Terry could see a person looking on curiously, but on the whole, only the women addicts were interested. Many of them moved their legs unconsciously as they watched the act build up to its climax. Porky stared at the women hungrily, saliva running out of the corner of his mouth and dripping down on his huge chest. After watching a little longer, Terry began to find the show repetitious, so she opened her small pack of dope and began to snort it up. While the women finished, they sat up on the floor and began to snort some dope off an album cover Smokey had set out beside them. Porky got up and waddled over to the bedroom door. He came back leading one of his huge German police dogs. He held the dog between his legs as he spoke to the women. "I'll tell you what I'll do," he began, his voice thick with desire. "I'll give either one of you half a fourth of dope if you'll freak off with Butch in front of everybody." He patted the dog on his back. Both of the women stared up at him angrily. Tess, the larger of the two, replied viciously, "I'll tell you what I'll do, you fat black son of a bitch, you. I'll give you a fourth of dope if you let us watch your dog fuck you in your fat black ass. What about that, you fucking freaking fucking motherfucker, you?" She spat out at him. For a brief moment, Porky felt a jolt of fear. He knew Tess was one of the most dangerous lesbians around. He searched the faces around the apartment until he saw one of his doormen watching him closely. He relaxed slightly. "Just because you done time for cutting up a nigga, girl, that ain't shit," he said with renewed courage. "If that nigga had been a man, he'd have kicked you in your ass and took that little funky whore you cut him up over." Tess jumped up, and began to put on the men's clothes she wore. Porky bit his lip nervously. He didn't want to lose her business. Between her and the prostitutes she kept, they spent quite a bit of money in the run of a week. Ever since she was released from prison, she had been using. He was sure that she was strung out now. If she kept using drugs, the day would come when she wouldn't find the thought of having one of her girls copulate with a dog repugnant. Porky's common sense cautioned him to be patient. He grinned suddenly. "God damn, Tess, baby. You know I was just joking with you, girl. I didn't think you'd take me serious and get rocks in your jaws, baby." He removed a $10 pack of dope from his pocket and tossed it to her. Tess caught the pack and bit back the acid remarks she had been about to make. "Yeah, Porky, just so long as we understand each other," she said, and smiled a knowing smile. Porky glanced across the room at Terry, who was nodding off her dope. Her neat little dress was pushed up around her thighs, revealing golden tan skin just above her stockings. As her head dropped down on her chest, her legs parted slightly, causing Pork to catch his breath. He stared in fascination. Sliding in his seat, he tried to peep up higher under her dress. His feverish mind began to undress her until he could visualize her completely naked. He pictured his dog's large head stuck up between her beautiful thighs. As the dog became excited, he imagined Butch biting and growling, his shaggy head shaking from side to side as blood from his bites came running down her legs. Her screams of pain then turned to moans of pleasure as he snatched the dog away and stuck his huge head in its place. Tess punched her woman in the side. As the prostitute turned to see what she wanted, she pointed over at Porky, who was deep into his vivid fantasy. Suddenly, she became aware of his obscene stare. Terry closed her legs and blushed. "Damn," she said to herself, "you're beginning to sit just like some common whore. Legs gaped all open for any man to look under your dress." Perversely, she thought, well, the bastard sure couldn't see nothing, no matter how hard he was trying. I should open them real wide. Maybe the son of a bitch will see enough to get his kicks off. She turned to Minnie. "Honey, I'm going to have to be getting on. I know I got a lot of explaining to do, so I think I better get on home." She stood up and opened her purse. "Porky, how much is a half a fort?" $30, Terry, but for you, baby, I'll let you have it for $25. Terry counted the money out slowly, remembering the promise she had made herself earlier. She justified her behavior by telling herself she would slowly cut down her wage until she could buy some medicine to help her kick. Porky disappeared into the bedroom. After closing the door behind him, he removed a small piece of tinfoil and began dumping a measured amount of dope into it. Then he took some pure heroin, uncut, and sprinkled it on top of the amount he already measured out, making it extra strong. Smokey, sitting on the bed, staring into space, watched his movements indifferently. She knew what he was doing and why he was doing it, and had she attempted to think about it, she would have known what girl he was fixing the potion for. When he finished, he pointed towards the dope. "Don't collect but $25 for it. It goes to Terry." Smokey carried out the dope and gave it to Terry. Terry turned around to call Minnie, but changed her mind. With the help of another addict, Minnie had got a hit up under her armpit, and now she was too involved in shooting the heroin to be disturbed. After paying for the dope, Terry started towards the door. Big Ed, one of Porky's protectors, got up to let her out. The gun resting under his left arm swung conspicuously as he leaned down and peeked through a peephole in the door before allowing her to leave. Big Ed was one of the only gunmen that Porky hired to protect him from the addicts. Without protection, the addicts would have stuck him up every day without fail. Most of the time, his gunmen would be addicts who were known for being vicious and who had the nerve to shoot if so pressured. He kept them supplied with drugs and enough money to take care of their personal needs. Most of the time, they just stayed there with him, not bothering to go elsewhere to sleep. None of them worked regular hours. They would just rotate as the mood hit them. Whenever they felt like it was getting time for a fix, they would trade places with one of the gunmen who had been up all night. That was the main thing about Porky's dope house. It never closed. Dope was sold 24 hours a day. Terry made her way down the stairs. She staggered when she got to the bottom. "Damn," she murmured. "This sure is a good blow." She made her way to her car and pulled away from the curb slowly. As she drove towards home, she continued to reject one lie after another. Finally, she decided to play it by ear. The dope in her system gave her not only courage, but also a feeling of not really caring what her parents thought about her losing her job. She stopped at a red light and lit a cigarette. Before the light changed, she had dropped the cigarette in her lap twice. Her eyes tried to close, but she fought the desire to nod and drove slowly on. She parked in front of her house, climbed out. There was no worry now, only a desire to get an unpleasant chore over with. When she entered her house, her parents were sitting in the front room waiting for her. They stared at her curiously. She leaned against the wall and stared back at them. Her father had a solemn look on his face while her mother seemed to be on the verge of crying at any moment. Her father cleared his throat. "Terry, we want you to explain what the hell is going on." Mrs. Breeding called and told us some very unpleasant news. "And we'd like to hear your side of this." "I knew it. I knew it," Terry shrilled. "Before you even hear my side of it, you've taken Mrs. Breeding's word for what happened." "Now, honey," Terry's mother said soothingly, "your father hasn't accused you of anything, dear. All he did was ask you your side of it." Cold and calculating, Terry stared at her parents. She knew she had her mother won over already, and she could see in her father's face that he wished he were at work or anywhere else except facing his daughter down at this moment. She changed her tactics. Her voice became wheedling. "I didn't do nothing but try and help this girl I used to go to school with, Daddy. She came in the store and I could see she was sick, you know. I think she uses that stuff. You know what they call it? Dope." Terry could tell by their faces that they were buying it wholeheartedly. "Well, anyway, Mother, the girl was pregnant and I felt sorry for her. So when she put these dresses in her box, I couldn't bring myself to call the floor walker on her, so I just let her go." She stopped to catch her breath. Her parents' faces were shining with hope. They wanted to believe her so badly that for a moment, she felt regret. She had never before resorted to lies when dealing with her parents. But then, she had never before been strung out on dope. For a moment, she felt like throwing herself in her mother's arms and telling her all of it. How she wished she were a young girl again so she could lie in her father's protecting arms with no worry in the world. Her mother spoke up hesitantly. "Mrs. Breeding gave us the impression that it was a little different, Terry." A flash of anger shot through her. For a second, she really believed she was the injured one. "Mrs. Breeding, huh?" Terry caught herself in time. She had almost said shit. "I'll tell you about Mrs. Breeding. Do you know how many times I've seen her catch white girls stealing and let them go?" She stared at her mother and saw her nod her head in agreement. "You know about that, don't you, Mother? I know she's told you about it when you're on the phone gossiping." Her mother came to Mrs. Breeding's defense as Terry knew she would. "Now, Terry, you know she lets young colored girls go, too, if she believes they've been scared enough." Terry snorted. "Well, she didn't want to let this young pregnant colored girl go today." She turned to her father. "Anyway, Daddy, you know what I mean. You run into the same thing out there where you work. White people do what they want to do, while you do what they tell you to do." Her father nodded his head. "You will have to go to another planet to find a black person who didn't know about discrimination." For the past 15 years, he had been trying to get the crane operator job in his factory, but he was always refused. He had been complaining for the last 10 years that it was because of his color. "Well, that about covers it, Daddy. If I had been a white girl instead of just some poor black nigger, they would have done anything. Just chewed me out about it." With the timing of a good diplomat, she had used one word she knew would make her father angry enough to change the whole subject. "Terry, you know what I told you about using that word," he said, his neck muscles swelling from anger. "Don't nobody but common-ass Negroes use that word in regards to themselves. It takes the lowest form of humanity to be stupid enough to call themselves something that the dictionary defines as low-life." Suddenly ashamed of having cursed in front of the two women he loved more than life itself, he walked over and patted his daughter affectionately but clumsily on the shoulder. "Don't worry about a thing, Terry. You can find another job when you get ready. And if you don't want to work, we'll make out." She turned quickly and started for the stairs. She didn't want them to see the tears that sprang up in her eyes. As she stumbled in the stairway, she felt disgusted with herself. How could she deceive them like that? When she reached the top of the stairs, tears were running down her cheeks unchecked. Terry sat on the bed, her head bowed, completely ashamed of her behavior. As if with a will of their own, her fingers began to move toward her purse. And before she was fully aware of it, she had taken out her package of heroin and opened it. Using a fingernail file, she scooped up a large amount of the white poison and snorted it. She seemed to be watching her motions from a distance outside her body. It was as though someone else were snorting the drug and she was just an innocent bystander. She failed to notice the opening of the bedroom door as she continued to snort the dope. She drifted into another world, free of worry and responsibility. Her eyes had become small pinpoints, while her spirit took off in a flight of euphoria. Her father's shocked voice brought her back to reality. "What is that stuff? What in the world are you doing? Terry! Terry! My Terry! You can't be using dope!" He continued, seeing it before his eyes, but not yet wanting to believe what he saw. "My God, this can't be you, Terry! Why, some kid brought up in the slum, yes, I can understand that, but not you, Terry! Not you! Why, you ain't never wanted for nothing! I used to work 2 jobs so that you and your mother could have anything you wanted!" Tears began to run down his face. His voice became hoarse, and then finally anger came. "Give me that stuff, Terry. Give it here." Terry moved as though her world was crashing down. She jumped to the end of the bed, clutching the heroin to her bosom. Her eyes were dilating with fear, while her nose seemed to expand with each breath. Her mother stood against the door, staring dumbfounded, her hand clutching at her heart. She repeated over and over as though it were a song. "It ain't true, honey. Not my little girl. Tell me it ain't true." Consumed by anger, her father snarled at her. "You no good little bitch." Then it was all true. Every goddamn word of it was true. And you come in here telling your goddamn lies, and we believe every word of it. Father and daughter stared at each other across the room. Terry, out of fear of losing the small amount of heroin that promised her she wouldn't wake up sick, didn't even think about trying to use reason with him. All her mind could grasp was the danger to her heroin. She knew that once her father got hold of it, she would never get it back. Her father's voice became low, filled with disgust. "Either you give me that dope, Terry, or get out of my house. I'm not going to have anyone living under my roof who takes that stuff." The words were like ice water in her face, but she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that she could not part with her drugs. "Well, if that's the case," she said slowly, "I hope you will leave me some privacy while I pack." Before the words were even out of her mouth, her mother slumped over and would have fallen if it had not been for her husband. He caught her and held her up. "I'm going to take your mother to her bedroom. I want you out of my house." Terry grabbed a few things and tossed them in a suitcase. She knew she would have to move fast before her father returned, because there was the possibility of his asking for the car keys. With the thought of losing her car in her mind, she raced around the room, gathering up only the things she knew she must have. In a few minutes, she was finished and on her way downstairs. This concludes this part of the miniseries on Ralph Reads. I would like to thank you, queens and kings, fellow royalty, for stopping by. You can connect with me via Twitter and Instagram, as well as Periscope at RGMC2407. Drop me an email over to rgmc2407@gmail.com. If you would like to leave a small donation, you may do so at paypal.me/RGMC2407 or the Cash App. My cash tag is RGMC2407. You may also find me on my very own channel, RGMC, Ralph Garcia, Master of Ceremonies, as well as right here at home on the United Ronin Networks. We are Ronin. fellow royalty. Pick up a good book, read a good story, and set your good self free. I appreciate you and love you like cooked food. I will see you folks on the next edition of Ralph Reads. Take care.